This is Adam Wolf. Welcome back. Recently, a lot of my studies and focal points have been around the concepts of differentiating between integration to isolation. It's a concept that I think has a lot of opportunity to divide, and I think that it's important to be able to divide because my experience is that if we do too much to the system too quickly, what happens is we overload the system and very easily send them into processes that they're already perpetuated or that we're trying to avoid. And so being able to understand the threshold of the person that we're working with becomes really important, and that's not always so easily to do or easily identifiable. And so when I came to movement, it was through the spectrum of integration. It's the way that I came to it, which like a lot of other people is not always the case. Most people learn it through the spectrum of isolation and that one muscle doing one thing in one plane of motion. Not that that's wrong, although to be really honest, early in my career I did think that that wasn't the greatest way to think about it, is that the isolated spectrum. My whole concept is that the body doesn't know what a muscle is. That's what I've learned from the people that I've had the opportunity to learn a lot from, including Gary Gray and David Tiberio and Michelle Dulcor and some of these other people. And so that concept of looking at a muscle was really hard for me. And so early in my career, everything for me was what I consider to be integrated integration. Everything had to be along that spectrum. If integration's at one end and if isolation's at the other end, isolated isolation, I always fell on that spectrum of integration. Over the past 10 years or so, especially the past 5 years, as I've been studying a lot of motor control theories and just the ways that the body really works, including that the nervous system is really what reconciles everything, and that the body is governed by the nervous system. If we do too much too soon for somebody, the potential is there very easily to overstep their neurological threshold. That word threshold is important. Threshold to me is that point in time when we can elicit a response, whatever type of response we want. If we think about the body from an integrated unit, mind, body, spirit, biology, psychology, sociology, physical, behavioral, biological, there are ways to create thresholds in all of those regions. I can create biological thresholds. I drink enough coffee and I got to go to the bathroom because my bladder's full. So the threshold. Behavioral thresholds of me getting upset when I'm in traffic, when I'm driving. I don't like that. It makes me crazy. Or when I'm in public and there's a lot of people around me. I prefer my solitude or to not have to be where there's so many people. And so that's my threshold of when a response is elicited for me when I'm placed into those situations, despite me even being aware of them. Movement thresholds, we see them all the time if we're talking about from the perception of being a movement practitioner, and if you're watching this and you probably are a movement practitioner. And so that movement threshold is something that I think a lot about, and I think there's a bunch of signs of when somebody's overstepped their movement threshold, including holding their breath. You should not be able to hold your breath when you're doing things. You should expect to have things be, you should be able to take a breath. I would expect things to be fluid as we move and rhythmical as we go through these movements. I wouldn't expect there to be asymmetry or arrhythmical movements. And for example, if I'm doing a lunge, the ability to load in and out cleanly and fluidly and rhythmically is what I'm looking for with somebody. If I reach and I come back, I want to see a sequential dissociation in and out, but what you'll see is there'll be a lot of times people will sort of pop in and out of it, or they won't be able to load it appropriately. There'll be a shock wave instead of a spring, a Nerf ball as opposed to a Super Ball. We always want to try to be a Nerf ball. And so to me, a Super Ball. Have that load to explode, but we lose that. And so those movement thresholds we see all the time, and what we need to recognize is if somebody is at their threshold and we try to push them beyond it, there's a process in a downward spiral or negative loop a lot of times that occur, and that loop includes that sympathetic dominance system that people tend to run in, especially if they're in pain. And if you're coming to me in pain, which most people do, if you're coming to see me, you're running sympathetic dominant, fight or flight. We need to get people to chill the F out, rest and digest a little bit, create parasympathetic dominance. And that needs to be stage one, I think, of exercise or of rehab when you're coming into me. I can give you all these fancy exercises and things to do, but if we're overstepping your threshold and if you're running sympathetic in nature anyway, it's just going to send you over and we're not going to see the results that we're wanting. And so more and more I believe that mission number one needs to be to downregulate the system a little bit, create some parasympathetic responses, because that's important and feeds forward into these other pieces. And so recognizing that threshold is really important. Tying that threshold to movement spectrum, we've got at one end of the spectrum, we've got what I would consider to be isolated isolation. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've got integrated integration. And in between, we've got these two stops that are sort of a combination of the two. We've got isolated integration at one end on the isolated spectrum. And we've got integrated isolation at the other end of the integrated spectrum, and kind of let's make up the middle two. But I think that those two stops are really important along the way. And so an example of isolated isolation would be what we consider just a shortening concentric muscle first, or concentric action first, where we just do the concentric action. So if it's my bicep or deltoid, if I was to just hold this position, that would be isolated isolation for my bicep right here. If it's my quadricep, isolated isolation maybe would be creating knee extension, where my quadricep or that muscle is working in one plane to create one motion at one joint, while the muscles above and below would be doing nothing. So maybe they're just kind of, I'm staying here in a straight leg raise on my back. Maybe I've got an isometric hold to the rest of my system to sort of ramp up, although who knows. So that's isolated isolation. Taking a step along the spectrum towards integration, we've got isolated integration. That would be considered something like maybe a straight-legged band walk, or something where that muscle that creates that knee extension is working with tissue above and below it also working in one plane of motion or two to create the shortening concentric first. So a straight leg raise would be an example of an isolated isolation. Maybe isolated integration would be I put bands around my legs and I do a giant walk, where I'm having to create that concentric knee extension motion, hip extension motion first, along with a whole bunch of other tissue above and below. Maybe that's an option, although I could think of other ones. Moving it along, we got isolated isolation, isolated integration. We go to integrated isolation. If we're relative to the quadricep, I would say in an integrated motion, what we're doing is maybe we're going to position that joint or muscle into its three-dimensional motion relative to its activity that we're looking at or addressing. Maybe if it's walking, my quadricep works to control my knee flexion in the sagittal plane, knee abduction and internal rotation in the frontal and the transverse plane. So maybe I set up my quadricep and my knee into that position that it would have to control at the transformational zone. So integrated isolation, we're positioning a whole bunch of joints above and below the tissue into an isometric hold to make it do what it would have to do relative to the intended task. So we've got an isometric hold through the whole system. Maybe I squeeze my whole body using the laws of Sherrington's laws of synergy and irradiation that talk about being able to ramp up and contraction to create more synergistic contraction. Maybe I start in this position with my knee slightly flexed and I've got all this tissue above and below here working to do what it would have to do when my foot hits the ground. It's doing it together in isometric. Then maybe I start adding a drive of my hands. So I've got a quadricep isometric hold right now, but my quadricep is getting a lot of input from above, or maybe it's my foot that reaches as I do it to create some more motion. So we've got isolated integration. We've got isolated isolation, isolated integration. Integrated isolation is what we just covered. And then integrated integration. And integrated integration would be, for me, it would be what that muscle and joint should do, when it should do it, in all three planes of motion with the joints above and below and tissue above and below also working together. So if it's the quadricep, maybe it's a lunge, getting my quadricep to control that flexion, abduction and internal rotation. Maybe it's a lunge with a reach. Maybe it's a squat or a single leg squat or a squat and a reach or a pull or something that's getting this combination of tissue to work together for its intended task. And so we can work that quadricep or any muscle, frankly, along a whole spectrum of movement. We just need to appreciate where we are, because if we know where we are on that line of movement, then we know where the thresholds, and we can look at thresholds and we can make sure that we're not overstepping it. Because as we're trying to produce, obviously we want to always work towards integrated integration. But if you can't do something isolated, then that's where we need to start. You certainly, if you can't do it laying down on the table with nothing else working, you're not going to be able to do it in upright. And so that's my thought process more and more as I'm working with people. Where on that spectrum are they? Can we see the signs of sympathetic dominance in each system and each stop along the way? And can we make sure that we're working right at that neurological threshold? So hopefully this spurs some discussion. Next week we'll give some more specifics, but this frankly can be done throughout the entire body, and more this is the way that I'm working. So just understanding where we're at. Again, this is Adam Wolf. Check out the blog, my podcast we got, Adam Wolf PT, teaching all around. So hopefully I'll see you soon. Thanks.